When you think about the Wild West, what do you envision? Daring outlaws riding across the prairie, duels at high noon maybe, or perhaps even buckskin-clad frontiersmen and Native American warriors. Whatever it is you're thinking about, I'm willing to bet that redheaded giant cannibals, cursed gold mines, and alien abductions probably aren't at the top of your list. At least not until today. What you're about to hear are three very true, yet very mysterious stories straight from the Old West. We'll start off with the Paiute legend all about redheaded cannibals in present-day Nevada. Yeah, Nevada. A mysterious tribe that some claim were actual giants. And what's more, there's archaeological evidence to back it up. Next, we'll take a look at the Lost Dutchman's Mine, a legendary gold mine in Arizona's Superstition Mountains. One that many think is protected by an ancient Apache curse. Oddly enough, there have been a ton of disappearances and even dead bodies discovered right there in the superstitions, many of whom were either found shot to death or beheaded, or both. And finally, we'll round things off with the story of mysterious Dave Mather, a sometimes lawman, sometimes outlaw, who brushed shoulders with the likes of Wyatt, Earp, and Holliday, only to suddenly vanish under very dubious circumstances. Eyewitnesses claim to have seen a flying orb, and then when Dave rode into a canyon to investigate, he was never seen again. Ooh, what could it be? Stick around and find out. Without further ado, let's dive into the mysteries of the Old West. Yeehaw! What if I told you there was once a tribe of giant red-headed cannibals roaming the deserts of Nevada? An ancient race of people so feared and so dangerous that their enemies eventually trapped them in a cave and burnt them alive. Every single man, woman, and child. Sounds a little too bizarre to be true, but this story has literally been passed down for generations among the northern Paiute. What's more, there's actual scientific evidence to back it up. Mummified remains that include what appear to be a very tall man with, you guessed it, red hair. And here's the crazy part. Those remains were located in the exact same cave where the Paiute allegedly exterminated the red-headed man-eaters. So who or what were these mysterious people? Were they really flesh-eating giants, or just a misunderstood tribe of outsiders? Or is there something far stranger buried beneath the centuries of Paiute oral traditions? Stick around and find out. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. The northern Paiute have called the Great Basin home for thousands of years, roaming throughout what's now known as eastern California, western Nevada, southeastern Oregon, and even parts of Idaho. Traditionally, they were semi-nomadic hunter-gatherers who moved seasonally to take advantage of the land's natural resources. They didn't really have any central leadership, so to speak, and each band, usually consisting of around 50 to 100 people, basically managed their own affairs. As far as the social roles are concerned, it was pretty straightforward. Men hunted and provided security, while women gathered and cared for their families. Now this next part kind of goes without saying, but the northern Paiute way of life would experience some very drastic changes with the arrival of European settlers and explorers. First, things were relatively peaceful, but it wasn't long before the ever-increasing encroachment sparked a series of deadly conflicts, the most famous being the Pyramid Lake War of 1860. That being the case, the northern Paiute were eventually relegated to various reservations. Still though, despite being stripped of their ancestral lands and many of their traditional ways, they did make strides to adapt. And thankfully, the northern Paiute are still with us to this very day. Not only are they federally recognized, but they continue to preserve their language and cultural traditions. Traditions that just so happen to include the legend of Ka, aka the red-headed cannibal giants of Nevada. I'm working on it, y'all. I'm going to mess up this pronunciation the entire episode. I don't even think I'm saying the word pronunciation right, but I'm going to work on Nevada first. Just bear with me. Now, the name Ka comes directly from the Paiute themselves and loosely translates to the Tule eaters. Tule, of course, being a type of reed that grows there in Nevada wetlands. Nevada, yeah, okay, I think I got it. There's actually some pretty serious questions as to whether or not that's an accurate translation, the Tule eaters. I'll touch on that a little bit later, but despite the alleged diet of reeds, the Ka were mostly known as cannibals. In fact, Sarah Winnemucca, the daughter of northern Paiute chief Winnemucca, would explicitly describe the Ka as a quote-unquote small tribe of barbarians who ate my people. There are even stories about them digging up recently deceased Paiutes and making meals of the cadavers. Now, thankfully, we don't have to rely solely on the words of Sarah Winnemucca. There's actually a pair of archaeologists, Llewellyn Loud and Mark Harrington, who spent time with the Paiute during the 1920s, and they too heard stories about these mysterious cannibals. According to them, while the Site Ka did speak the same language as the northern Paiute, they were culturally distinct. Apparently, they favored spears over bows and arrows, they used different types of stones for their tools, and they even dressed differently. Per Paiute oral traditions, the Site Ka were, quote, mean, contemptible, foolish, degraded cannibals who had red hair which they were excessively fond of decorating with bone ornaments, and yet were so poor that they dressed in robes made of the skin and feathers of mud hens, end of quote. Now, we will expand on the evidence later on, but for now, let's go ahead and discuss the actual war that took place between the Paiute and the Site Ka. Once again, according to Sarah Winnemucca, quote, among the traditions of our people is one of a small tribe of barbarians that used to live along the Humboldt River. They used to waylay my people and kill and eat them. They would dig large holes in our trails at night, and if any of our people traveled at night, which they did for they were afraid of these barbarous people, they would oftentimes fall into these holes. They would even come and dig up our dead after they were buried and would carry them off and eat them. Now and then they would come and make war on my people. They would fight, and as fast as they killed one another on either side, the women would carry off those who were killed. My people say they were very brave. When they were fighting, they would jump up in the air after the arrows that went over their heads and shoot the same arrows back again. My people took some of them into their families, but they could not make them like themselves, so at last they made war on them. End of quote. Now, unfortunately, I don't have any other details regarding the war itself, other than its tragic ending. Paiutes were eventually able to corner the Site Ka inside of a large cave about 100 or so miles northeast of present-day Reno, what's now known as Lockland Cave. And once the cannibals were trapped inside, the Paiute covered the mouth of the cave with brush and kindling and set it on fire. Nowhere else to run, every last one of the cannibals perished right there in the smoke and flames. Now, as to when all of this occurred, it really just depends on who you ask. Sarah Winnemucca claimed that it was many hundreds of years ago, while her brother Natchez said that it was within 4 or 5 generations, which, depending on how you define a generation, could put it as recently as the early 1800s. And then, of course, there's the remarkable claim recorded by one of the aforementioned archaeologists, that of an old Paiute man who had died just a few years prior, but who supposedly had taken part in the battle. He even had wounds to prove it. So yeah, not everyone agrees on every last detail, especially regarding when the battle occurred, but these discrepancies aside, Paiute oral tradition is remarkably consistent on 2 key details. Number 1, the Site Ka were an extremely violent, hostile people. And number 2, the Paiutes eradicated them. The dates and minor details might change from one person to the next, but they all agreed that the Site Ka were wiped out in a fiery and very final confrontation. You know, when it comes to these types of ancient oral stories, it can be very hard to separate fact from fiction. Mostly because there's no real way of corroborating them. Not like we have contemporary newspaper articles or diary entries or anything like that. All we have is air, words spoken from one family member to another over the course of hundreds of years, like a giant game of telephone taking place over half a millennium. Normally, I would just assume that, okay, maybe there was a big fight way back in the day, and maybe the Paiute did indeed annihilate an encroaching tribe. Or maybe they themselves were the encroaching tribe and they just eradicated the original inhabitants. Maybe a few of these so-called cannibals were a little on the tall side. Maybe they dyed their hair red with berries or ochre or something like that. And maybe they even practiced a form of ritualistic cannibalism. And over the course of years, the stories just kind of snowballed from there. Next thing you know, we have this legendary race of redheaded giants roaming Nevada and eating dead bodies. And I do think this is true for every other culture. We all have similar type stories that get passed down from one generation to the next, especially when it comes to religion. And very rarely do we ever uncover concrete proof to verify these legends. In the case of the Nevada cannibals, however, such evidence does exist. Kind of. Okay, so in the year 1911, a pair of miners, David Pugh and James Hart, were granted permission to harvest bat guano from a cave near the small town of Lovelock, Nevada. Same cave, in fact, where the Paiute claimed to have slaughtered the Site Ka. By the way, if you're not familiar, guano is just a fancy word for bat shit. Apparently, it was a big business back in the old days and used as a high-grade fertilizer. Or to quote Arkansas Dave Rudaball, I have been to silver towns, gold towns, and I've even been to a turquoise town, but I have never been to a batshit town. Can't wait to see the women. Now, as valuable as guano may have been, Pew and Hart would end up discovering an altogether different sort of treasure. There in the cave, under about 4 feet of batshit, were mummified human remains, along with a cache of ancient artifacts. And that ain't all. According to miner James Hart, one of the bodies measured 6.5 feet tall and, wait for it, had distinctly red hair. Word of the discovery soon spread, and unfortunately many of the cave's priceless contents suffered because of it. Remember, these guys weren't scientists or archaeologists, so they weren't exactly handling the artifacts with kid gloves. That being the case, in the first year alone, countless items were either destroyed or lost. Hell, a local fraternal lodge even boiled one of the best preserved mummies to use in their creepy-ass initiation rituals. Suffice it to say, by the time the actual professionals were brought in a year later, much of the damage had already been done. Still, though, what remained was pretty impressive. Eventually, over 10,000 artifacts from the Lovelock cave were cataloged, including some of the oldest and most well-preserved items ever found in the Great Basin, among which were woven tule sandals, netting, baskets, and even ancient duck decoys, dating all the way back to the time of Jesus. As I'm sure you can imagine, these discoveries only served to add further fuel to an already compelling story. Ancient remains, some with red hair, buried in the same exact cave where the Paiutes allegedly killed the Site Ka. It was almost as if archaeology itself was confirming the legend. And yeah, maybe. But as with most good mysteries, the truth is often a bit more complicated. Either way, it was right there at the cave where the Site Ka legend really began to evolve from a story about hostile neighbors into something much bigger and stranger than anyone could have expected. So here's the thing. Paiute oral tradition has never specifically described the Site Ka as giants. That little detail doesn't seem to have crept in until after the cave discoveries. The tale naturally caught the public's attention, and in an era hungry for sensational stories, it was only a matter of time before someone made the leap. If one skeleton was taller than average, then they must have all been giants. And besides, who doesn't love a good giant story? I'll tell you what this reminds me of. I remember back when things were first starting to kick off over in Afghanistan, and all those stories started flooding in about U.S. troops engaging in firefights with literal giants. Giants, by the way, that were also said to have had red hair. And the most amazing part is, people actually believe those stories, despite there being zero evidence. So yeah, the idea that folks in the early 20th century would also fall prey to such tall tales isn't really all that surprising. But like I said, the truth is oftentimes more complicated. And stories aside, the archaeologists failed to turn up any evidence whatsoever of a race of giants. In fact, most of the remains there in the cave were ordinary in size. Yes, there was that one mummy that was a little on the large side, but 6.5 feet tall ain't exactly supernatural, okay? Trust me, I used to work with a guy who was 6'9", and I can assure you he was fully human, at least on his good days. As for the red hair, experts often point out that hair pigment can change after death. Environmental factors such as temperature, mineral content, and even soil conditions can cause dark hair to fade to a rusty red or orange over time. In other words, those fabled redheaded giants weren't really giants at all. What's more, their hair probably wasn't even red. Now, scientific observations notwithstanding, the public had a field day. Toss in the fact that the region also has an abundance of Ice Age fossils like mammoth bones and giant cave bears, and it's easy to see how things could get twisted. I mean, think about it. To someone unfamiliar with ancient bones, a mammoth femur could easily be mistaken for the leg of a 12-foot-tall man. Author Adrienne Mayer, who studied giants for her book Fossil Legends of the First Americans, argued that many of these giant myths most likely began as attempts to explain fossil discoveries. And when combined with the very real oral histories of hostile man-eaters, the myth took on a life of its own. Whereas the Site Ka were once remembered simply as a dangerous tribe with cannibalistic tendencies, they were all of a sudden reimagined in the public at large as giant red-headed monsters, sort of an American counterpart to Europe's ogres and trolls. It was this blending of archaeology, oral history, and sensationalism that ultimately transformed the Site Ka from a cultural memory into something much larger, literally. And once that particular version of the story took hold, it was nearly impossible to separate fact from folklore. Which brings me to the very real battle between skepticism and belief. The story of the Site Ka is always sort of set at a crossroads between history and legend. On one hand, you have the Northern Paiute oral tradition, a war with a hostile tribe that ended with said tribe's annihilation. But on the other hand, you have archaeology, which, while confirming that an ancient culture did once occupy Lovelock Cave, paints a very different picture from the redheaded giant cannibals of popular imagination. Matter of fact, those professional archaeologists who excavated the cave would end up concluding that the artifacts belonged to a group known as the Lovelock culture, a pre-Paiute people who lived in the region for thousands of years. The items they left behind, tooly sandals, duck decoys, and intricate baskets, all suggest a people who relied heavily on fishing and waterfowl, not necessarily human flesh. As for the mummified remains with the red hair, once again, modern science explains how hair pigment can change after death. So with all of that rationality in mind, why does the red-headed giant narrative still persist? Well, I think part of it's just human nature. We all love a good mystery. When you combine a dramatic oral history, an unusual archaeological find, and a taller-than-average mummy, it's easy for imaginations to run wild. And as tends to be the case, additional fringe theories have blossomed over time. There are some who think that the Site Ka were an unknown species of humans. Others link them to biblical giants like the Nephilim, and still others wove them into tales of ancient aliens or lost civilizations. I mean, that's kind of what we do, right? Anytime there's something that our brains can't compute, we just invent stories to make it more palatable. But yeah, despite these modern embellishments, I do think the core story remains important. Not because it proves that giants existed or anything like that, but because it preserves a very valuable piece of Paiute history. Sure, oral traditions often mix memory with myth, but they also carry kernels of truth. In this case, evidence of an ancient conflict and of a culture long gone. In the end, I think belief in the Site Ka really just boils down to the individual. For some, it's a thrilling legend that proves there's more to history than what's been jotted down in the textbooks. For others, it's a cautionary tale about how oral traditions and archaeology can tell vastly different stories. And for the Paiute, it's a constant reminder of the resilience and survival. A tale about coming face to face with a terrifying and physically superior enemy and coming out on top. Now, full disclosure, while I do remain skeptical, there are a few other details that sort of give me pause. And yes, the giant myth has been thoroughly debunked, but I'm not so sure about the red hair. But Josh, you said that hair can fade or even change colors after death. Yeah, I know what I said, but here's the thing. That process takes time. You don't go from being a brunette to a blonde or even a ginger immediately following death. It's not an instant transformation. It also relies heavily on environmental conditions. Keep in mind that the Paiute specifically recalled the cannibals having red hair while they were still alive. And those stories absolutely predate the mummified discoveries at Lovelock Cave. Hell, there were even some Paiutes in the early 20th century who still had some of that red hair woven onto their clothing. But then again, like I said earlier, maybe they had naturally dark hair and they just dyed it red. So I don't know, man. Gun to my head, if I had to decide right now, I'd say that the archaeologists were most likely correct. The Site Ka were simply a different band of natives living in the Great Basin prior to the arrival of the Northern Paiute. The two cultures ended up clashing, one thing led to another, and the Site Ka, sadly, were destroyed. God only knows, they certainly wouldn't be the only group eradicated over the course of human history. Or maybe, if you go back far enough, the Northern Paiute and the Site Ka were one and the same. Remember, even the Paiute admitted that they spoke the same language. Maybe something occurred a long time ago and they splintered off into two separate tribes, sort of like the Comanche and the Shoshone. I also think that a lot of the mystery can be explained away as translation issues. I alluded to this earlier, but even the Paiute word for today's topic, the Site Ka, is up for debate. A lot of people think it was mistranslated. So, could the same thing be true for the red hair? Was that just another word that the archaeologists didn't properly understand? A lighter hue of black, maybe, that sounds very similar to the Paiute word for red. I don't know, I'm just tossing out theories here. By the way, one other thing that I failed to mention is the Paiute claimed the Site Ka were covered with hair. Yet another weird twist. To our more modern ears, such a description could bring forth visions of Sasquatch. But then again, I don't think I'm out of line by saying that most American indigenous groups, Paiute included, have way less body hair than your typical gringo. I myself have extremely hairy arms, to the point I've even had people from other cultures ask me why they're so damn hairy. So, once again, was this a tribe of people that were completely covered in hair, or did they just have, beards and hairy arms and hairy legs? As far as the whole cannibal thing is concerned, I even think that's questionable. We know historically that other non-cannibalistic societies were branded as man-eaters simply as a way of dehumanizing them. After all, it's much easier to sleep at night knowing that the people you burnt alive were monsters as opposed to fellow human beings. But what do you think? Did the Site Ka even exist? And if so, were they just another tribe of natives, or was there something more at play? Were they supernatural beings that proved far too dangerous to live amongst us mere mortals? Were they wayward Europeans who migrated to the interior after an ancient shipwreck? Or were they simply man-eating Sasquatches? What do you think they were? I am genuinely curious to hear your thoughts. You can drop a comment down below if you're watching on YouTube, or email me directly at josh@wildwestextra.com. Thank you so much for joining me. If today's story brought you some type of value, if I temporarily cured your boredom, or just tickled your fancy, consider heading over to buymeacoffee.com/wildwest and buying me a coffee, or 2 or 7. All right, and I guess that's about all I've got for today. Till next time, try not to eat any of your neighbors, okay? Don't go picking a fight with some other tribe just because they're different. And whatever you do, never, ever, 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 ever trust a redhead. They don't call them fire crotches for nothing. Yeehaw! What if I told you there was a hidden gold mine in Arizona? One that, if located, would turn you into an instant billionaire. There's just one catch. Hundreds, if not thousands of people have already gone in search of it. Several dozen of whom were never seen again. At least not alive. Thus is the legend of the lost Dutchman's mine, a fabled motherlode hidden somewhere in Arizona's Superstition Mountains. Mountains, by the way, that are allegedly protected by an ancient Apache curse. Oh my. But how true are these stories? Is there any evidence that the lost Dutchman mine ever even existed? What about the Peralta stones? Are those real or just an elaborate hoax? And what's up with all of the people who have been found decapitated right there in the Superstition Mountains? Stick around and find out. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. The Lost Dutchman Mine was originally named after German immigrant Jacob Waltz. He first arrived in Arizona in the early 1860s, and by 1870, he was homesteading near Phoenix, about 60 or so miles west of the Superstition Mountains. More on him in just a few minutes, but first, I do think it's important to establish a backstory. As it turns out, the legend of the Lost Dutchman Mine goes way back, long before Jacob Waltz was even so much as a twinkle in his daddy's eyes, even before the founding of the United States. You see, way back in the year 1750, a Spanish family, known as the Peraltas, were granted a huge chunk of land from the King of Spain, over 3,700 square miles along Arizona's Gila River, including the Superstition Mountains. When Patriarch Miguel Sr. passed away in 1788, the land went to his son, Miguel II, who prospected the area with his own sons, Pedro, Ramon, and Manuel. Full disclosure, but there are no official records to support these claims. In fact, historians can't even say for certain if the Peralta family truly existed. The only thing we know for sure is that there was a Pedro de Peralta who served as the governor of New Mexico in the early 17th century. Everything else is essentially folklore, rumors, and anecdotal stories just passed down from one generation to the next. I just wanted to point that out because what I'm about to tell you, specifically in regard to the Peralta family, is a tad bit on the dubious side, okay? In other words, there is no real evidence to back any of it up. But still, the Peraltas are a very integral part of the legend, so it is worth sharing. So, with all that in mind, per the legend, the Peraltas began digging for gold there in the Superstition Mountains at some point in the early 1800s. And by the year 1845, they had hit the mother lode, a golden goose that Don Miguel christened the Sombrero Mine, on account of a nearby peak resembling a sombrero. That peak, by the way, is now known as Weaver's Needle. But yeah, like I said, the Peraltas hit pay dirt. A vein of ore so rich with gold that if it were to be located nowadays, it's estimated to be worth billions, if not trillions of dollars. The only problem was the land they were mining was smack dab in the middle of Apache territory. And this is at a time when Apache raids were becoming much more frequent. But be that as it may, the Peraltas didn't really have any issues with the indigenous. The Apaches were certainly aware of their presence, but they didn't consider them to be a threat. At least not at first. Now, in the months that followed, the Peraltas established a total of 8 mines there in the mountains. As such, it didn't take too long for them to collect a good amount of ore. And eventually, they decided to haul some of it down to Mexico for a much-needed vacation. Perez de Conister, in her book The Sterling Legend, quote, "In preparation for their journey, they discovered they had accumulated much more gold than they could possibly transport in a single trip. After giving the matter considerable thought, they selected what they believed to be a safe place and cached the surplus gold with intentions of retrieving it on their next trip. To make sure that the location of all the mines would be known to all 3 of them, Pedro drew 3 maps showing the location of each of the 8 mines. Keeping one for himself, he gave the other 2 to Manuel and Ramon." End of quote. And yeah, the trip went off without a hitch. The brothers arrived in Mexico safe and sound, and were even able to secure a buyer for the gold. And like I said, they even stuck around for a while to enjoy the fruits of their labor. Leastways they did until they heard of the impending invasion of American troops. A little dust-up known as the Mexican-American War. And naturally, not wanting their treasure to fall into the hands of the gringos, brothers Ramon and Pedro rushed north to secure as much of the gold as possible. To once more quote Mrs. Conister, "Thus a few weeks later, the final expedition was underway. There were almost 100 men and twice as many pack animals. It was indeed a sight to behold, and upon reaching the Superstition area, it was a sight that did not please the Apaches. To them, such a large number of white men could only mean one thing: trouble. But in their usual manner, they bided their time and waited until everything was in their favor before making their move." End of quote. And yeah, you know what happens next, right? It was a total bloodbath. The Apaches not only killed Pedro and Ramon Peralta, but they also massacred their hired hands. Allegedly. There are some versions of the story claiming that 1 or 2 survivors did make it back to Mexico, but that they were either unwilling or unable to return to the mines. Now, after the war, there were a ton of American settlers flocking to Arizona territory, 2 of whom were prospectors Aloysius Hurley and Sean O'Connor. The adventurous duo began exploring the Superstition Mountains in the early 1850s, and as fate would have it, they stumbled upon the remains of a dead burro, possibly one of the Peralta pack animals killed by the Apache. What's more, buried in the ground nearby was a rotted-out pack saddle filled to the brim with gold concentrate. Now, whether or not Hurley and O'Connor were aware of the Peralta massacre is unknown, but I guess they figured where there's one dead donkey carrying gold, there might be more dead donkeys carrying gold. A philosophy that I personally try to live my life by. So they continued searching, and sure enough, they did locate another pack saddle full of gold concentrate. At this point, the lucky prospectors had a 3-pronged mission. First, they had to extract the gold from the ore, as the deposits were just too heavy to carry out between the 2 of them. And then they had to get it smelted, and then finally, number 3, they had to locate a buyer. All this without arousing too much suspicion. And on that front, they were successful. They made it all the way to San Francisco, where they sold the gold to the U.S. Mint for $37,000, or around $1.5 million in today's money. Now keep in mind that we are still discussing the legend. Hurley and O'Connor aren't always included in the various stories, but it does at least somewhat help to explain what happened to the gold from the Peralta massacre, if it even actually occurred. Either way, the mine, or mines, would continue to remain a secret until the arrival of the guy I mentioned earlier, the Dutchman himself, Jacob Waltz. And just to be clear, Waltz was a German immigrant from Prussia, okay, not the Netherlands. Not sure if this is common in other countries, but historically here in the United States, Germans have been labeled Dutch, mostly due to confusion over the German word Deutsch, not to be confused with the very American word douche. As far as Waltz goes, he first arrived here in America in the late 1830s. He initially settled in St. Louis, but would eventually head west to California. You could actually find him there on the 1860 federal census, living in sunny Los Angeles and employed as a miner. Not long thereafter, he migrated to Arizona, where he continued to prospect. In fact, he even filed on 3 separate claims up in Yavapai County. Didn't strike it rich, though. Instead, he did like most of the other prospectors and worked as a laborer for other, more successful miners, guys like fellow Prussian Henry Wickenburg. If you're not familiar, it was Wickenburg who discovered the extremely lucrative Vulture Mine, about 70 or so miles northwest of Phoenix. Speaking of Phoenix, a guy by the name of Jake Willing took a large group of men down to the Salt River in 1867 to help dig an irrigation canal, which is basically how the town of Phoenix, Arizona came to be. And while we can't prove for a fact that Waltz was one of the laborers who helped dig the canal, we do know that he began homesteading near Phoenix around that same period, putting him all that much closer to the fabled Superstition Mountains. Now, as to how Waltz actually discovered the mine, once again, nobody can say for sure, but there are three main stories. One is that his Apache girlfriend told him about the gold and even guided him straight to it, only to later on have her tongue cut out by her fellow Apaches for betrayal. The other story is that Waltz and fellow prospector Jacob Weisner simply stumbled upon the mine out of pure dumb luck. Luck. That's not a word. Luck is the word I'm looking for. Pure dumb luck. And finally, there is a story claiming that Waltz learned about the mine from none other than Miguel Peralta himself. In fact, according to an article published in a Prescott newspaper shortly after Waltz's death, Don Miguel even drew him a map. Per Robert Sikorsky in his book Fool's Gold, quote, armed with a map and verbal accounts, Waltz journeyed to Tucson where he revealed his secret to Jacob Weiser, countryman whom he persuaded to join in the search for the Peralta properties. Eventually, Waltz and Weiser reached the south side of the Superstition Mountains and proceeded up the first long draw leading to the interior, as per instructions written on the map. They soon found the trail which led over the top of the main mountain and down a long ridge, past Sombrero Butte, into a deep, brush-covered canyon. From there, the trail meandered through a small boulder-strewn arroyo. I always struggle with that word, arroyo, eventually terminating at the diggings. Now, the next part is a little crazy, but just as soon as they arrived there at the mine, they heard someone breaking rock. Upon closer inspection, they saw what appeared to be three Apache warriors pounding and sorting ore. So they immediately opened fire and killed all three of them. Here's the catch, though. They weren't really Apaches. They were former employees of Miguel Peralta, who had slipped away from his ranch to do a little prospecting of their own. As I'm sure you can imagine, Waltz and Weiser were more than a little nervous after just murdering three people, so they quickly gathered up as much gold as they could carry and began making their way back down the mountain. That's when the real Apaches showed up, and brother, they were not happy. In the chaos that ensued, the prospectors became separated. Waltz eventually made his way back to Phoenix unscathed, as a mortally wounded Weiser sought refuge with a friendly band of Pima. He'd linger for about a week before eventually succumbing to his wounds. Once again, per Robert Sikorsky, quote, at the same time, Judge John D. Walker, owner of the famous Veckel mine, was living with the Pimas in one of their villages about 18 miles west of the present town of Florence. Weiser, after 3 days of torturous travel, staggered into his camp, weak and exhausted. Walker did what he could to relieve his pain, but at the end of a week, the German contracted a fever and died. While still rational, he told Judge Walker about his adventure and gave him the gold he managed to salvage. Walker was evidently busy with other matters at the time, for he failed to investigate the story, although Weiser gave him full directions on how to find the monumented trail to the mine. End of quote. Now, years later, Walker would share his story with a newspaper out of Florence, and it was supposedly corroborated by Waltz himself. But then again, there are other stories claiming that it was Waltz who killed Weiser, or Weisner as he's sometimes referred to, just in order to keep all the gold for himself. Other versions claim that he left Weiser alone in the mountains, and that's when the man was murdered. Whatever the case, Jacob Waltz would eventually return to the Superstitions. And according to S.D. Conister, from this point on, most variations of the legend seem to coincide, and for all practical purposes, tell the same story. For the next decade or so, Waltz rarely went to the mine, but each time he did, he would return with gold. It was these trips that fostered the portion of the legend that is so well known today and tells of how the Dutchman, cleverly evading all who attempted to follow, would disappear into the mountains and reappear in Phoenix, scant few days later with a burro laden with gold, or so rich that it could be shipped directly to the mint without processing. Now, that may all be true, but I do think it's worth noting that Waltz did not lead an extravagant lifestyle. There were no lavish mansions or fancy carriages or anything like that. He kept on living pretty much the same as he had before. I think he built an adobe there on his homestead, but that's about it. In fact, in 1878, he did something that you wouldn't really expect from someone that was swimming in money. He sold all of his property and everything on it to his neighbor, Andrew Starr, for just $50 in cash. 50, along with the guarantee that Starr would look after Waltz for the rest of his life. Sounds a little weird, but you gotta think. Waltz would have been pushing 70 years of age at this point. He would live for another 13 years, so it's not like he was at death's door or anything, but all that time prospecting had likely taken its toll. He wasn't able to really tend to his own property anymore, much less make arduous trips to the mountains, so I guess this is just his way of securing a little help. Besides, it's not like he had a wife or kids to look after him in his old age. That said, it wasn't until Waltz's death in October of 1891 that the madness surrounding the mine really began in earnest, mostly due to 50 pounds of gold being located in a secret stash under his bed. Ooh, the plot thickens. Once again, allegedly. Okay, that should be the subtitle to this entire episode. Allegedly. Story goes that a guy named Richard J. Holmes was present at the time of Waltz's death, and Waltz gave him the box of gold, along with directions to the mine, just moments before passing away. Is this true? I have no idea, but I do know that word soon began to spread, and the rumors alone were enough to convince people that the mine did exist. By the way, it was originally called Dutch Jacob's Mine. It wasn't until years later that the lost Dutchman name was finally coined. As far as the location goes, Waltz was also said to have shared his secret with a lady who nursed him during his final months, Julia Thomas. And much like with Holmes, he even drew her a map. According to a newspaper out of Tucson, less than a year after Waltz's death, quote, Mrs. Thomas, formerly of the Thomas Ice Cream Parlors, is now in the Superstition Mountains engaged in work usually deemed strange to the women's sphere. She is prospecting for a lost mine, the location of which she believes she holds the key. But somehow she has failed after 2 months' work to locate the bonanza, though aided by 2 men. The story of the mine is founded upon the usual deathbed revelations of the ancient miner, usual in such cases. There is also a lost cabin connected with it. The location is supposed to be a short distance back from the western end of the main Superstition Mountains. End of quote. Now, those 2 men that Julia Thomas partnered with were brothers Reinhardt and Herman Petrasch. Reinhardt was actually a resident of Phoenix and one of Julia's hired hands. He was also a companion to Jacob Waltz during his final days. As such, he was also present for the prospector's final moments when he shared the location of the treasure. His brother Herman was brought in after the fact. The trio left Phoenix in August 1892 and headed straight for Weaver's Needle. They made camp in Needle Canyon for 3 weeks, but, as I alluded to a moment ago, despite their best efforts, they just could not locate Waltz's mysterious mine. Eventually, they had to return to Phoenix after running out of provisions. For Thomas, the entire trip was a financial disaster. She wasn't a rich woman to begin with, and what little money she had went to funding the expedition. And after failing to discover the gold, she abandoned it altogether and got married. That said, she was still able to turn a profit by selling treasure maps. Whether or not those maps were accurate, I will let you decide. Now, remember what I said about word spreading. Indeed, in the months immediately following Jacob's death, the story of the lost mine proved very popular, as people from all over the country rushed to the mountains looking to try their luck. Then, in November of 1894, just to further stir the public's imagination, Julia Thomas released the very first public directions to the mine. Quote, in a gulch in the Superstition Mountains, the location of which is described by certain landmarks, there is a 2-room house in the mouth of a cave on the side of a slope near the gulch. Just across the gulch, about 200 yards opposite this house in the cave, is a tunnel, well covered up and concealed in the bushes. Here is the mine, the richest in the world according to Dutch Jacob. Some distance above the tunnel on the side of the mountain is a shaft or incline that is not so steep, but one can climb down. This too is covered carefully. The shaft goes right down in the midst of the rich gold ledge, where it can be picked off in flakes of almost pure gold. Now, as you may have noticed, the directions provided by Miss Thomas tell you what to do when you reach the gulch, but not how to get there. It wasn't until many years later that a full guide was eventually published, but just like with every other aspect of the story, the directions changed with each new rendition. By the way, that stone house that she mentioned in the mouth of the cave, it was allegedly located by a journalist/adventurer named Pierpont Bicknell around the turn of the century. But even then, Bicknell failed to locate the hidden mine. Still, though, with the location of the cabin now public knowledge, allegedly, it was only a matter of time until someone found the gold, right? Wrong. To this day, the lost Dutchman mine has still not been located. Or if it has, whoever found it's pretty damn good at keeping secrets. Now, if there was an army doctor stationed in nearby Fort McDowell, a guy by the name of Abraham Thorne, who treated an Apache for an eye disease. And as a show of gratitude, the warrior blindfolded Thorne, brought him inside one of his hidden mines, and told him to take as much gold as he could carry. And yeah, okay, maybe. I don't know about you, but I'm not letting anybody blindfold me and take me to a cave in the mountains, unless they have a very large and succulent booty. But the reason I bring this story up is due to speculation that Walt's and Thorne's mines were one and the same, especially if you consider the Apache connection. It's also worth noting that there have been other gold mines discovered in the general vicinity, any of which could possibly be the fabled Lost Dutchman's mine. Who knows, maybe Waltz was just really bad when it came to giving directions. Now, during the early 20th century, the popularity of the mine did begin to plummet. Every now and then, you'd get an excited treasure hunter who thought he held the one and true map, but nothing ever really came of it. It wasn't until the 1931 death of adventurer Adolph Ruth that the Lost Dutchman's mine once again started making headlines. Story goes that Ruth had obtained a map from someone who claimed to have gotten it from the Peraltas, and thus provisioned, he set out to the mountains alone, looking to strike it rich. Only problem was, Mr. Ruth was pushing 70 years of age with a bad hip. What's more, it was in the dead of summer. Unsurprisingly, he was never heard from again. His skull was eventually discovered several months later, but it'd be a few weeks after that until the rest of his body was found, supposedly near Blacktop Mesa. The sheriff's office investigated, and according to them, Ruth died of natural causes, and the animal simply carried the skull away from the body. And okay, fine, I do think that's believable, but a different story soon began to circulate alleging that Ruth had been shot in the head and decapitated. To add further intrigue, investigators also found Ruth's notebook. In it, the treasure hunter claimed to not only have found the mine, but even scribbled down the directions. He ended his entry with the triumphant words, Veni, Vidi, Vici. Or for those of you who don't think about the Roman Empire all that often, I came, I saw, I conquered. By the way, the idea that Adolph Ruth was shot in the head, rather than dying of thirst or starvation or even a heart attack, comes from just one unverified coroner's report. A document that, to the best of my knowledge, nobody else has been able to corroborate. Shady evidence aside, I'm sure you can guess which of the stories the press decided to run with. Rather than go with the admittedly boring tale of an old man succumbing to the elements, they decided to print the sensational claims that Ruth had been murdered and decapitated, all while in search of a lost gold mine. Another twist came a couple of decades later when a vacationing couple found a series of strange stone tablets. 4 in total, one of which was shaped like a heart and inscribed with what appeared to be directions. There were even names like Pedro and Manuel carved into the stones, leading many to conclude that they were references to the Peraltas and their lost mine. So yeah, with all these new developments, it was only a matter of time until the Lost Dutchman's mine experienced a revival. The public was not only intrigued, but wasn't long before folks once again began flocking to the mountains, in droves, looking to solve the mystery. Sadly, more than a few of them have suffered the same fate as Adolph Ruth. I was unable to find an exact number, but it's thought that at least 30 people have perished while actively searching for the treasure. And that's not including all the people who just happen to be in the mountain for other purposes, like camping or hiking. And yeah, some of these people were also allegedly decapitated. In fact, in 1960, there was a headless skeleton discovered near the foot of a cliff, right there in the Superstition Mountains. And within the next month, 2 additional bodies were found nearby, causes of death unknown. As far as I'm aware, they still had their heads. In 1961, a family picnicking near the edge of the mountains discovered a body buried beneath the sand. The victim, later determined to be Charles Boheen, had been shot in the back. A couple months after that, a prospector named Walter Mowry was found dead in Needle Canyon. Despite his body being riddled with bullets, his death was ruled a suicide. 5 days later, a painter from San Francisco, William Harvey, was also found dead. Cause of death undetermined. 1963, a guy by the name of Vance Bacon fell to his death after allegedly being fired upon. And he was not the only person who supposedly got sniped at in that same area. And I could go on and on, man. 1964, brothers Richard and Robert Cremus found dead at the bottom of a high cliff. That same year, the headless body of Jay Clapp was discovered. That's right, yet another decapitation. Apparently, Clapp had gone missing 3 years prior. 1970, seasoned prospector Al Morrow killed by a falling boulder. 1973, man was shot dead at his campsite. 1976, 2 more prospectors were found dead of gunshot wounds. 1978, Manuel Valdez found murdered. 1980, another skeleton discovered, later identified as Rick Finning. 1984, prospector Walt Gassler, who devoted much of his life to looking for the mine, was found dead with gold in his backpack, almost identical to the rich ore that Jacob Waltz had sold a century prior. And like I said, these are just a few of the examples. Even as recently as 2009, a 35-year-old from Denver disappeared while searching for the mine. His remains weren't identified until 2013. Same thing happened to 3 hikers from Utah in 2010. Hell, just last year, in 2024, a guy went on a day hike there in the Superstition Mountains, and he never returned. So yeah, I'd say there does appear to be something fishy going on, at least at first glance. But then again, devil's advocate, a ton of people do visit the Superstition Mountains each and every year, and the vast majority of them come out just fine. In fact, here in the United States, over 300 million people visit national parks annually. And out of all those people in all of the national parks combined, only a little over 1,000 go missing. And most of those 1,000 are located safe and sound. They just get turned around on hiking trails or overheated or whatever. So I don't know, man. Yes, people have gone missing and even died in the Superstition Mountains under what appear to be mysterious circumstances. But I do think at some point we've got to take Occam's razor into account, or the idea that the simplest explanation is oftentimes the most plausible. Maybe I'm crazy. You tell me, which scenario do you find the most likely? That there's some supernatural curse or other deviant force protecting a mysterious gold mine that thus far has not even yet been proven to exist, or that a tiny, tiny, tiny percentage of people are just succumbing to the usual injuries that come with hiking in the mountains. And then, of course, you've got the psychological aspect. You got an area with a super cool yet creepy name like the Superstition Mountains, coupled with all the legends and tall tales, and you're naturally going to be a little hyper aware. All of a sudden, the sound of a squirrel scurrying up a tree is going to put you on edge. You're going to start seeing ancient Apache warriors behind every rock. So I don't know, maybe I'm too much of a skeptic, but while the Lost Dutchman mine seems very compelling on the surface, there really doesn't appear to be anything of substance there. And as tends to be the case, once you dig just a little deeper, the entire legend begins to unravel. I'll give you a for instance. I touched on this earlier, but there is zero evidence that the Peralta family even existed, at least in regards to owning a huge land grant or mining gold in the Superstition Mountains. Don't get me wrong, there was a Peralta mine in the mid-19th century. It was even owned by a guy named Manuel Peralta. Only thing is, it was located in California as opposed to Arizona. But here's the crazy part. When the California mine went belly up, Manuel Peralta became a swindler. He sold a fraudulent 3 million acre Spanish land grant to a Dr. George Willing down in Arizona. And this was in the late 1860s, mind you. So right around the same time that this entire legend was beginning to emerge. Although Willing figured out fairly quickly that he'd been conned, his partner James Rivas continued to assert that the fraudulent grant was indeed authentic, even after Willing passed away. There's a lot more involved, but before it was all said and done, Rivas was given a $5,000 fine, sentenced to 2 years in prison. I bring this up because there are a lot of people, myself included, who think that the very real story of Manuel Peralta and his fraudulent land grant was coupled with a few other stories, some of which may be true, others just tall tales. And over time, these stories have all got lumped together and they sort of morphed into the legend of the Lost Dutchman's mine. I'll give you another example. Remember the guy I mentioned earlier, the Army Dr. Thorne, who treated the Apache with the eye disease? Well, as it turns out, there are no records of a Dr. Thorne ever working for the Army. There was a real Dr. Thorne, and he did allegedly discover gold, just not in Arizona. The real doctor claimed to have found a rich vein over in New Mexico after being taken captive by the Navajo in the early 1850s. Later told some soldiers about the gold, they went looking, but returned empty-handed. Much like with Manuel Peralta and the California mine, I do think that Dr. Thorne's story over the years just kind of got absorbed into the Lost Dutchman's myth. I mean, you got to keep in mind that these stories were circulating long before Jacob Waltz ever stepped foot in the Superstition Mountains. As far as the Peralta stones are concerned, I don't have any proof one way or the other, but from just what little I know, they smack of a hoax. In fact, this entire story is giving me some serious Oak Island vibes. I'm actually kind of surprised that the History Channel doesn't have a crew up in the Superstition Mountains 24/7 just milking their viewers for all they're worth. Now, for the record, I am not the only skeptic out there, okay? The great author and Western historian Marshall Trimble is also not buying the hype, at least not anymore. In a 2019 edition of True West magazine, Mr. Trimble stated, quote, "The Lost Dutchman is one of the greatest lost mine stories of them all. I've spent years studying and writing about it, and even searching for it. And I don't believe Jacob Waltz had a fabulous gold mine in the Superstitions." Mr. Trimble then goes on to say that the bulk of the story seems to be embellished by the aforementioned Pierpont Bicknell. He's the guy I mentioned earlier who allegedly discovered that cabin in the mouth of the cave. I sort of glossed over Bicknell's involvement, but he really does seem to be the main author of the entire legend. Born in Syracuse, New York, around 1836, the highly educated Bickle first arrived in Arizona at some point in 1870. He started writing for the newspapers as well as doing a little prospecting and treasure hunting on the side. He never had much luck locating any of these various lost mines, but he did make some pretty decent money writing about them. His stories proved extremely popular, and they were chock full of embellishments. And many of those embellishments have helped to launch the Lost Dutchman's mine to mythical proportions. Or, to once again quote Marshall Trimble, "With a great display of literary license and embellishment, Bicknell created the legend we are most familiar with today. He provided provocative clues to the whereabouts of the Dutchman's gold, and for the first time he used the phrase, Dutchman's lost gold, incorporating the weaver's needle into the tell." End of quote. Trimble even thinks it was Bicknell who made up the story about the Peralta family being massacred by the Apaches. By the way, I did reach out to Mr. Trimble, mostly just to ask if any gold at all has ever been found in the Superstition Mountains. And he replied that yes, gold was found in the area. There were mines in the early 1900s, including the Mormon Girl and the Mammoth around Goldfield in the western area, and they are still mining in the far east side of the range. However, the legend of the mine focuses on Weaver's Needle, but geologically, there is no gold around there. These tales were told to steer treasure hunters away from the areas where gold could be found. The latest info I have on the Dutchman's mine is from my friend Jesse Feldman, who spent a lifetime searching in the superstitions. According to Jesse in his book, The Dutchman's Trail, the mine did exist, but it was 10 miles east of Weaver's Needle in the vicinity of the Silver King mine. So there is gold in them thar hills, just not around Weaver's Needle. I already knew that because I searched for it in the 1960s before it became a wilderness area. Hope this helps. End of quote, and thank you, Mr. Marshall Trimble. Now you may be asking yourself, if there was no gold mine near Weaver's Needle, then where did Jacob Waltz get all that gold? Especially considering that he never filed on a claim anywhere in the Superstition Mountains. Well, if you'll recall, I mentioned how Waltz had previously been employed at Henry Wickenburg's Vulture Mine. Apparently all that ore that was being transferred from the mine was very poorly supervised, and Wickenburg had a ton of issues with people stealing from him, a process known as high grading. I've even read sources alleging that as much as half of the ore that was pulled out of the Vulture Mine was stolen. And there are some who think that Waltz got whatever gold he had by also stealing from Mr. Wickenburg. Now, full disclosure, there is no real evidence. Once again, there's that word again, evidence. There's no real evidence other than hearsay that Jacob Waltz even worked for Henry Wickenburg. That too is purely apocryphal, like pretty much every other detail in today's story. However, that doesn't necessarily rule out the Venture Mine. After all, Waltz could have simply been the middleman, sort of a fence, who paired up the thieves with their buyers. And yeah, I guess that's about all I've got on the Lost Dutchman's mine. It's my opinion that is just a combination of many different events that were told, tall tales and legends that were told over and over and over again, and they just all got lumped into one story of the Lost Dutchman's mine. I think probably Waltz did have some gold. Maybe he stole it from somebody else. Maybe he got it from one of his older mines. I don't know, but yeah, I'm going to say this one is probably busted. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that the Lost Dutchman mine most likely does not exist. Okay, so don't you and your buddies get all liquored up and go out there looking for it and blame me when you break your leg. But what do you think? Am I an idiot? Is there more to the story than meets the eye? Did I leave out any important information? Or am I being bought off by big gold? You didn't think of that, did you? Yeehaw! You ever hear of a gunfighter so slippery that he was able to dodge bullets, murder charges, and possibly even gravity itself? Meet mysterious Dave Mather, part outlaw, part lawman, and total question mark. Mather may have ran with the likes of Wyatt Earp and Dirty Dave Rudaball, but at the very peak of his infamy, he simply vanished. No grave, no body, no final dramatic shootout, nothing. He was just gone. The only question is where. How true are the stories about Dave fleeing to Canada and becoming a Mountie? What about the rumors that he was killed by moonshiners in Tennessee, or that he reinvented himself out west in California? Or did something far stranger catch up with him? Something otherworldly, perhaps. And yeah, I am referring to little green men from outer space. Buckle up, because this one is definitely gonna get weird. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. David Allen Mather was born on August 10th, 1851, in what's now known as Deep River, Connecticut. And for those of you looking for a thorough rundown of Dave's early life, well, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but there's just not a lot out there. Story goes that Dave's father, Ulysses, abandoned the family in 1856 to become a ship captain, which in hindsight may not have been all that great of a decision, as he was murdered by his own crew in 1864. Sadly, Dave's mother, Lydia, would also die before he reached adulthood. By 1860, he was living with his maternal grandfather, and by 1870, an either 18 or 19-year-old Mather could be found on the federal census living in Westbrook, Connecticut, employed as a laborer. It wasn't until later on in that same year that he and his little brother Josiah followed in their daddy's footsteps and took to sailing the high seas. Just not for very long. As soon as their cargo ship docked in New Orleans, the boys headed inland. And that's where things start to get really mysterious. For the next few years, we really don't have any idea what Dave was up to. There are rumors, though. Boy, howdy are there. Mostly unsubstantiated stories claiming that he did everything from hunting bison on the Kansas prairie to rustling cattle with Dave Rudaball over in Arkansas. Hell, there's even an unverified report of him running a con game down in Texas with none other than Wyatt Earp. About the closest I can find to an actual verified mention comes from a Dodge City newspaper in 1879, which named him as a regular associate of the notorious horse thief Dutch Henry Bourne. So yeah, as you can see, there's about a decade there where we honestly don't really know what mysterious Dave Mather was up to. What we know for certain, though, is that by the late 1870s, he was running with the Dodge City gang down in Las Vegas, New Mexico. East Las Vegas, New Mexico, to be exact. Now, if you're a longtime listener, you've heard me mention these guys many times in the past. But for those of you who are new, the Dodge City Gang was essentially just a loose network of gamblers, saloon owners, and gunmen led by an old boy by the name of Hyman Neal, aka Hoodoo Brown. In fact, Hoodoo, in addition to serving as mayor of East Las Vegas, was also the town coroner, the justice of the peace, and even the chief constable. His deputies included such Old West luminaries as Dirty Dave Rudaball, Tom Pickett, Joe Carson, J.J. Webb, and yeah, even our very own mysterious Dave Mather. I keep wanting to call him Mathers, but I'm pretty sure he's not related to Eminem, so I'll try to rein that in. By the way, a lot of these guys had been previously acquainted back in Dodge City, hence the name, the Dodge City Gang. So I do think it's likely that mysterious Dave also spent time in Dodge before drifting south. It's also worth noting that these guys were just a little bit on the crooked side. Hell, Rudaball and Joe Carson would even rob a stagecoach outside of Vegas in August 1879. A crime that was ultimately pinned on 3 innocent men. They would occasionally do real honest-to-God police work, though. Like in late January of 1880, when Dave and Carson responded to a disturbance over at the Close and Patterson Variety Hall. Per historian David G. Thomas, quote, on January 22nd, 4 Texas Panhandle cowboys, Tom Dutch Henry, James West, William Tom Randall, and Jim Loco Dorsey, rode into Las Vegas with the intention of settling a score with Las Vegas Constable Joe Carson. A week earlier, Carson had questioned the men about stealing a 2-horse buggy, for which there was an enticing $500 reward. He was driven off with harsh words. About 11 p.m., the 4 men entered the Close and Patterson's late-night dance hall, belligerently drunk and heavily armed. End of quote. When mysterious Dave finally arrived on the scene, he requested that the cowboys check their sidearms with the bartender. They refused and began hurling insults at him. They then turned their attention to Deputy Carson, saying that no man could make them give up their pistols. Then, without warning, Tom Henry shucked iron and put a bullet in Carson's left arm. Mysterious Dave responded by shooting Henry, at which point all hell broke loose. According to a local paper, the lamps in the dance hall were extinguished by the repeated concussions, and then followed a scene that beggars description. At least 30 shots were fired almost simultaneously, the leaden missiles of death flying as thick as hailstones around the crowded room. And yeah, when the smoke cleared, Joe Carson was dead, and Randall lay mortally wounded. His buddy James West was likewise wounded, and apparently in all the chaos, the other two cowpokes, Henry and Dorsey, were able to escape. As for Mather, he proved to be just as lucky as he was mysterious. Whereas Carson had been riddled with no less than 8 bullets, Dave had received nothing more than a grazing wound. Well, just 3 days later, on January 25th, he would kill yet again. This time a guy by the name of Joseph Costello, a railroad foreman who had made the grave mistake of going for his pistol during an argument. Luckily for Dave, a coroner's jury would rule the killing as self-defense. Imagine that. Now, be that as it may, the good citizens of East Las Vegas were very quickly growing weary of Mather and his associates. The following month, those two guys who escaped that gunfight, Henry and Dorsey, they were apprehended and thrown in the same jail as their wounded compadre, James West. And a couple of nights after that is when the vigilantes came a-calling. The prisoners were taken to the town square, where one of them was lynched from the windmill. The other two were forced to stand on said windmill, as, according to the paper out of Santa Fe, they were quote-unquote perforated with bullets that were allegedly fired by Joe Carson's widow. Now, we don't know whether or not Dave Mather took part in these unsanctioned killings, but considering his friendship with Carson and his position as constable, I'm willing to bet that at the very least he turned a blind eye. Skip ahead to early March, and another Vegas deputy, J.J. Webb, shot and killed a freighter named Michael Kelleher. Per the March 9th, 1880 edition of the Dodge City Globe, quote, at about 4 a.m., 3 men, headed by Michael Kelleher, entered the Goodlet and Roberts Saloon. All being intoxicated and heavily armed, they soon became very boisterous. Police Officer Webb, being present and fearing that trouble would arise, ordered them to depart. Kelleher refused, exclaiming, "I won't be disarmed." He drew his pistol and was just in the act of leveling the weapon when Webb, taking in the situation at once, and quick as a wink, pulled his pistol and instantly fired a ball into his chest. Kelleher dropped to his side but still showed fight. The officer fired twice more, balls lodging in the breast and head. Kelleher dropped over on the floor and died without speaking. End of quote. And yeah, that's the official story, but things may have been a tad bit more complicated than reported. You see, the victim, Michael Kelleher, had just finished driving a load of freight all the way from South Dakota and had over $2,000 on his person, which, adjusted for inflation, is close to $64,000 in today's money. Just so happens that Dirty Dave Rudaball was also in the saloon when Kelleher was killed, as was the mayor/coroner, Hoodoo Brown. And surprise, surprise, according to both Dave and Brown, the killing was justifiable. And to be honest, that might be true. I mean, there are people even to this day who do think that Webb was justified. Others, however, maintain that he assassinated Kelleher on orders from Hoodoo. Matter of fact, Hoodoo would actually skip town shortly thereafter with the money that they took off of Kelleher's body. Wasn't long before a judge put 2 and 2 together and had Webb arrested and charged with murder. That was in early March of 1880, okay? A month later, Rudaball and one of his buddies gunned down a respected jailer while attempting to bust Webb out of the clink. A senseless killing that proved to be the last straw for the good folks of East Las Vegas. They soon formed a vigilance committee and put what remained of the Dodge City gang on notice. Rather than stick around and wait on a hangman's noose, Mysterious Dave wisely chose to try his luck in a more agreeable climate. And by a more agreeable climate, I do mean Dodge City, Kansas. Just in time for the Dodge City War. Now, this so-called war is nowhere near as exciting as the name suggests. In all reality, it was just a highly publicized standoff between the mayor, Larry Degger, and a gambler by the name of Luke Short. And by the way, if you're interested in learning more about some of these people I'm naming, I do have a full episode on Dave Rudaball, and I also have an entire episode devoted to Luke Short and the Dodge City War. I'll drop some links down below if you're curious. But basically, Dagger was just trying to force Short out of town. So in turn, Luke assembled a team of badasses, including Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, and former sheriff Charlie Bassett. With support from the governor of Kansas and growing pressure from economic powerhouses like the Santa Fe Railroad, both sides were eventually able to resolve their differences. And Luke Short's Long Branch Saloon was allowed to reopen. The entire ordeal proved completely bloodless, but the presence of so many noted gunmen did make the citizens of Dodge somewhat nervous, which may have been how Mather landed the job as assistant marshal in the first place. I didn't mention that yet, did I? Yeah, so when he got to town, he was made assistant marshal, a position that he would only hold for a very short amount of time. There would be another election shortly thereafter, and the new mayor appointed the legendary Bill Tillman as the new town marshal. He also replaced Mysterious Dave with a former buffalo hunter named Tom Nixon. In other words, Mather was out of a job. Kind of. I mean, he was still a deputy sheriff for Ford County at the same time, and the following month, after he lost his position as assistant marshal, he purchased the Opera House Saloon with his buddy, David Black. So it's not like he was destitute or anything, but he did seem to harbor a grudge against his replacement, Tom Nixon. More on Tom in just a moment. In the meantime, Mather busied himself renovating the saloon into a dance hall. Or at least he did until the city council ordered him to stop. They even passed an ordinance outlawing, quote, what is commonly known as a dance hall, or any other place where lewd women and men congregate with the purpose of dancing or otherwise, end of quote. Otherwise doing a lot of work there. Only problem was the ordinance wasn't being fairly enforced. In fact, Dave's rival, the aforementioned Tom Nixon, also owned a dance hall known as the Lady Gay. Now, whereas Dave's joint was effectively put out of business, Nixon was allowed to continue hosting dancing gals with zero repercussions. Whether or not this was a deliberate favoritism or just selective enforcement is unclear, but it certainly did add fuel to an already simmering fire. So Mather fought back by lowering the price of beer to just 5 cents a glass, less than half of what the Lady Gay was charging. In turn, Nixon and the other saloon owners retaliated by pressuring wholesalers to cut off Mather's supply of beer. And just to further aggravate matters, evidence suggests that Mysterious Dave may have had the hots for Nixon's wife, Cornelia. Not sure how true that is, but I do know that things finally came to a head on the evening of July 18th, 1884. Dave was standing on the steps in front of his saloon when all of a sudden Nixon walked up and opened fire. Keep in mind that Nixon is acting assistant marshal at this point, and he just walks up and tries to murder a dude. Per the July 19th edition of the Dodge City Democrat, quote, the bullet went wild and struck the woodwork of the porch. Mather's face was considerably powder burned, and the little finger of his left hand was injured by a splinter, end of quote. Telling you, this dude was more lucky than he was mysterious. They should have called his ass Lucky Dave Mather. Now, Bill Tillman's wife Zoe would later remark somewhat prophetically that when it comes to a man like Dave Mather, you better shoot straight or not at all, because if you miss, he will get you. And sure enough, Tom Nixon got. Killing occurred just a few nights later as Nixon was making his rounds. Dave waited until the lawman was walking by and then called out his name. And then, according to the papers, quote, as Nixon turned around, Mather commenced shooting at him, firing 4 shots, killing him instantly. An eyewitness would later state that Dave told Nixon that he had lived long enough before finishing him off. And upon being arrested, he claimed that his only regret was not killing him 6 months earlier. No word on whether or not he was able to hook up with Cornelia. Now, Dave would be tried for murder, but this tends to be the case with these types of Old West shootouts. He was ultimately acquitted. You know, people have this idea of the Old West being very hard on crime, and I am here to tell you, after spending years researching this stuff, as long as you didn't fall prey to a lynch mob and you actually made it to trial, 9 times out of 10, you were going to get acquitted. And Mysterious Dave Mather was no different. Of course, it didn't hurt matters none that the sheriff testified on his behalf. So did Bat Masterson. Apparently, the locals were on his side as well, as the Dodge City Times would report that the courtroom broke out into applause when Mather received his acquittal. He wouldn't remain a free man for very long, though. He was soon joined there in Dodge by his little brother, Josiah. And in May of 1885, they got into a shooting scrape over at the Junction Saloon. Details are a little sketchy, but Dave and a gambler named Barnes got into an argument over a game of 7-Up. One thing led to another. Some sources claim that Mather attempted to steal the pot, and when Barnes complained, Dave punched him in the face. And that's when Barnes went for his pistol. And once the smoke cleared, Barnes was dead and 2 bystanders were wounded. Dave was arrested yet again, but oddly enough, his pistol was found to be fully loaded, indicating that while he may have started the fight, he didn't actually take part in the shooting. Nevertheless, both he and his brother Josiah were charged with murder. The pair were able to post bond just a few weeks later, on July 29th, after which they promptly got the hell out of Dodge. And this is where things really start to get mysterious. We know that the brothers eventually split up shortly after leaving Dodge. Josiah would go to Utah and then Idaho, where he would continue living all the way until his death in 1932. Dave would make a brief stop in Topeka before taking a job as a city marshal in the town of New Kiowa, Kansas. Or at least that's what the Dodge City Times reported in August of 1885. Truth is, Mather did pay a visit to New Kiowa with his old saloon partner, David Black, but he was definitely not appointed as marshal. In fact, they were only in town for a few days before Black was forced to flee after killing a soldier. A lynch mob was formed, and after they failed to locate Black, they turned their attention on Mather, who likewise chose to haul ass. And that was it. That was the last, for sure, verified sighting of mysterious Dave Mather. To this day, nobody knows for certain what became of him. One of the earliest rumors regarding his fate comes from Dallas, Texas in 1886. That's when reports surfaced of an unidentified man's body being located next to the railroad tracks, dead from a gunshot wound to the head. Worth noting that no official record exists tying the body to Mather. Okay, I just want to make that clear. The alleged identification seems to have been based entirely on gossip. Another popular theory is that Dave drifted north and joined the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. This particular story seems to originate in an article published in Everybody's Magazine in 1902, written by Edward Little. According to Little, Mather not only joined the Mounties, but he also robbed a stagecoach that he'd been assigned to protect. And once he was found out, he pulled yet another disappearing act. There's just one catch, though. The Mounties were pretty damn meticulous when it came to keeping records, and there is not a single reference to a David Mather ever serving with them. I suppose he could have enlisted under an alias, that's always possible, but at the same time, you have to consider the source. Little's reporting was based entirely on hearsay. But then again, there was another story that surfaced in the 1950s, alleging that Dave was serving with the Mounties as late as 1921. So who knows, there may be a kernel of truth in there, but once again, there is no actual proof. One of the more believable stories comes out of Long Pine, Nebraska in 1887. Just a couple of years after he disappeared. Numerous people who had allegedly known Dave from Dodge City claimed to have seen him living there in Nebraska. Others claim that Dave moved to California, where he started committing crimes under the alias of Dave Taylor, while others maintain that he retired as a U.S. Customs officer up in Washington State. His brother Josiah would later say that he was killed by moonshiners in the mountains of Tennessee, but at the same time, he told his children that he never saw Dave again after they parted company in Kansas. Now, my absolute favorite theory out of all of them is the one about him being abducted by aliens. And I'm not making this up, by the way. This is a real story, kind of. I mean, it's a story that I didn't make up, at least. Okay, so it first appeared in the Frontier Times magazine in 1963 and was quickly picked up by tabloids nationwide. According to the legend, Dave was hunting down cattle rustlers in northern Mexico in 1889 when he and his posse encountered what they described as a silver bowl in the sky. One of the members of the posse, a then teenager named Jorge Hernandez, would later claim on his deathbed that the UFO stayed just ahead of him, darting back and forth across the sky in spurts. And then when the group split up to investigate, Dave went down a canyon alone. And he never came out. The strange craft was then seen rising into the sky and vanished. The posse was able to locate Mather's horse, fully saddled and seemingly agitated, but there was absolutely zero sign of Dave. No footprints, no blood, nothing. They even had an indigenous tracker with them who allegedly muttered, Pueblo de Cielo, or Cielo, whatever the fuck, Spanish for sky people, basically. And then he rode away and refused to ever speak of it again. Needless to say, there is no contemporary record of this ever happening, okay? The story didn't appear until decades later, and it was almost certainly born from someone's very active imagination. But damn it sure is fun to think about. Look, at the end of the day, nobody can say for certain what happened to mysterious Dave Mather. And in a way, I do think that's fitting, especially considering his nickname. But you tell me, what do you think? Was Dave really killed in Texas? Did he serve with the Mounties up in Canada? Or did he reinvent himself anew in California or Washington State? Hit me up at Josh at Wild West Extra or drop a comment down below. I am genuinely curious to hear your thoughts. Who knows, maybe the alien story is true and Dave is still out there somewhere, living in a galaxy far, far away. Maybe he's flying a starship across the universe divide. And maybe when he reaches the other side, he'll find a place to rest his spirit if he can. And perhaps he'll even become a highwayman again. Or hear me out, maybe Dave will become a single drop of rain. Whatever the case, I do think he will remain. And he'll be back again, and again, and again, and again, and again, and again, and again. And so will I, next week, with more true tales from the Wild West. Until then, be nice to one another, and adios.